The idea of democratic representation relates historically and conceptually to a constellation of other concepts and institutional arrangements: sovereignty and legislation, the state and the nation, the idea of the people and popular will, constitutionalism and division of power, the right of the majority and the right of minority and opposition. How do you see representative democracy within such a larger context?
I have like one maybe a controversial point here is that I don't think that representation is inherently related to the concept of sovereignty. Contrary to most, maybe most of you. Because, for instance, I mean, Montesquieu clearly says that representations comes from the feudal practices. He has no real theory of sovereignty. I must insist on that because he uses the term supreme power, sovereign power in his definition of democracy, but that doesn't mean that he has a whole theory of sovereignty like Baudin or Hobbes or Rousseau later. So Locke is also an important theoretician of representation. In a way, he has no theory of sovereignty. It's quite interesting because in David Mazel's translation of the Second Treatise, actually, David Mazel, who is French, will introduce the word sovereignty in his translation, where Locke says supreme power. And he introduces people where Locke says community. So we have to be careful, I think, with this effect of translation. The concept of sovereignty was not that prominent all over Europe at that time in the 17th century. And second, of course, Rousseau is an important, we already mentioned Rousseau. Rousseau is a thinker of sovereignty. He's not a thinker of representation. So I think there is no mechanical link between both, especially among theorists. I'm not talking about history there. I'm talking about theorists. Second, about legislation, you're perfectly right. Well, for instance, if we take the origins of, like, for instance, Edward Coke. So we're now in the 16th century. Coke writes in the Journal of the House of Lords in April 1593, I quote Coke, "His Majesty and the nobles, being everyone a great person, represented but themselves. But the commons, though they were but inferior men, yet every one of them represented 1,000 of men." So basically, the distinction between the House of Lords and the House of Commons is built upon the idea of like who should detain the supremacy within the legislative power. And there is this whole debate of like, is the House of Commons, does the House of Commons have the supremacy? I think that's very important within legislation. Third, about the relationship to the people, popular will, public opinion, all that. I think, of course, we have this very interesting debate about free or imperative debate, binding instructions, or free mandates. For instance, Sydney is very interesting for that, actually, saying that contrary to the États généraux in France, the MPs in England, we always, I quote him, we always may and often do give instructions to our delegate, but the less we fetter them, the more we manifest our own rights, etc., etc. So the idea that actually you don't really need really need binding instructions in order to represent the people and voice public opinion. The second issue, because it's related to agonistic democracy or participation and representation, the second issue is about petitions. Petitions were very important at the beginning of the representative process. For instance, in the US, during the colonial period, where there were all these colonial assemblies, township meetings, and a very participative conception of representation. At that time, actually, the constitutions of 1776 gave a very important status to the right of petition. And I think that you cannot think about representation at that time without thinking about petition, because that's the way, actually, if you have free mandate, That's the way some had actually binding instruction. But if you have free mandate, you need petitions for the voters actually to be able to express their voice and be heard by their representatives. So both are really, really clearly related. And finally, the relationship with the concept of separation of powers. Of course, it's extremely important in Montesquieu. Not only the division between the legislative, executive, and judiciary branches of government, but within the legislative. Actually, I think it's even more important, the idea that the House of Lords and the House of Commons should represent different kind of interests. And that's Montesquieu's idea that civil society is clearly divided. So social interests are divided, civil society is divided, and representation has to institutionalize this class division, basically, civil society. It doesn't transcend those interests. So I think that separation of power is interesting, but also within the legislative power, because Montesquieu thinks that checks and balances are first and foremost within the legislative power. And even the king has actually participates within the legislative power with his right of veto. So this is my point. I think it's maybe something that is also underestimated in the, let's say, standard history of representation.
Okay, Nadia.
Yes, to go on this, this is extremely important. The question of equality that through Montesquieu comes very clearly. So if you have a society of equals, like in a democracy, right, then representation, according to him, cannot work. You need to have differences inside of society. This from there, Hegel would develop this idea of corporate organization of society in order to have transmit or transport these differences at the institutional level. But otherwise, you have that the majority is going to rule. If you don't have internal divisions inside of society or a pluralism. So equality becomes an important issue to consider. We don't, until now we didn't discuss. Second, let's go to the part on the three conceptions of democracy: participatory, deliberative, agonistic. It's very interesting that none of them are very attentive to representation. At least if you go to the founders or the great speakers of each of them. Participatory was, think about Benjamin Barber or Carol Patton. They were concerned about how to revitalize local assemblies or activities, even a kind of federalization of society in order to avoid the elitist moment of elections. And representation was identified with elections precisely according to the minimalist or Schumpeterian. So they picked up from that conceptions in order to conclude that this is a violation of participation. So they didn't see representation as a form of participation. We have to. The second is deliberation. I was also very interested in seeing the presence of deliberation in representation in Habermas. This will come after. Certainly when Habermas writes Facts and Norms, and also Cohen after him and whatever, the discussion or the interest is not in representation, and I will come to that, but in the formation of opinions or in the formations of reasonability of the entire sovereign people power. But as for the representation, since it was connected also for the liberationists at the beginning, they assumed, and thus they criticized, the interpretation of so-called minimalists connecting together participation and elections in this identifiable way. The idea is that, and this is important, that elections and participation, they introduce an element that is difficult for the deliberative theory to make room for, meaning partisan definition of groups. not simply different diversities, but partisan diversity, because when you enter in elections, you enter in a use of deliberation that is more debate than deliberation, more contestation than deliberation. So it's very problematic, thus, to connect deliberation and representation, if by representation we mean representation through elections, of course. If you take away elections, it's fine. It's less difficult somehow. As for the agonistic one, perhaps I'm wrong, has been defined in relation, distinction, and polemical differentiation with the deliberationist. So doesn't have, at least the agonist from Laclau or this tradition or Mouffe, he's defined against deliberation. So, but they don't deny the value of elections, the competitive, actually, the fight over the conflict, as they say, the conflicting theory of democracy. They don't consider relevant the question of representations as a terrain of discussion. This is what I recall from these basic foundational representatives of the three branches that you mentioned. So it comes from outside them, the attention to representation in the 90s. You know, if you open the book by Melissa Williams or Young, they don't discuss inside of, they don't come from inside of deliberation. They comes from inside of the marginalized groups or diversity like gender and so on and so forth. So it's a claim of representation, thus. It's not a problem of violation of democracy or and so on and so forth.